These are the slopes of Meon Hill in Warwickshire, England. It was here 72 years ago that the body of a local man by the name of Charles Walton was discovered lying next to a hedgerow by his niece and his next door neighbour. Warwickshire is steeped in a history of black magic and witchcraft. Some say this history is fact, and some say it's simply mythology. Either way, the murder of Charles Walton on St. Valentine's Day 1945 led to speculation that witchcraft was indeed alive and well in 1940s England. In fact, the case would become known as the Witchcraft Murder. A short distance from this spot lies the village of Lower Quinton, once home to local agricultural worker Charles Walton. The 74-year-old widow lived in the village with his niece Edith Walton, whom he adopted when she was 3 years old, after her mother died. It's said that he was considered a lonely man by his neighbours, but he was also a respected member of his community. On the morning of Wednesday, February 14, 1945, Walton left his home in Lower Quinton to begin work pruning the hedges in a field known as Hillground on Meon Hill. At approximately 9 a.m, he was seen by 2 witnesses crossing the local churchyard en route to his place of employment, a position he had held for the past 9 months or so, working for a local farmer by the name of Alfred Potter. This was one of the last times Charles Walton was seen alive. When Edith Walton, Charles's niece, arrived home from work at 4 p.m. that day, she had expected to see her uncle there. After discovering that he was not home, she panicked, because she knew, due to his solitary nature and clockwork-like routine, that it was unlikely that he had been held up by any kind of social meeting. She alerted her neighbour Harry Beasley. He accompanied her to the Firs farm, the place where her uncle worked. There they met the owner and Walton's employer Alfred Potter, who said that he had seen Charles at around noon that day, cutting hedges in his nearby field. When they arrived there, they found the body of Charles Walton lying next to a hedgerow. He had been battered to death with his own walking stick, and pinned to the ground with a pitchfork which had been thrust upon his neck. His throat had been cut deeply with his own slash hook, the double-edged pruning knife he used in his everyday work. The wound was so deep and had been delivered with such force that the hook was buried deep in the soil beneath him, and the handle had been bent backwards. Edith was immediately overcome by grief, and a passer-by by the name of Harry Peachy, who was alerted by her screams, ran over to help. Edith was taken home by Harry Beasley, while the police were called to the scene. They arrived just after 7 p.m, followed by the Stratford-on-Avon CID, and then by Professor James Webster of the West Midlands Forensic Laboratory. After the lawmen had carried out their work, the body of Charles Walton was finally removed at 1:30 a.m. The approximate time of death was given as between noon and 2 p.m. Some reports say that a cross was carved into his lower neck and chest, but this was never mentioned in the autopsy report undertaken by Professor James Webster. Detective Superintendent Alex Spooner was put in charge of the case, but because of the grim nature and subsequent media attention of the crime, the famous detective Robert Fabian and his assistant Detective Sergeant Albert Webb were appointed to join the investigation on February 16th. Robert Fabian was against the idea that the murder was related to the occult, but following the so-called wall of silence that he was faced with whilst trying to collect information from the people of Lower Quinton, he became convinced that the community were at least hiding something. Back in 1945, a prisoner of war camp in nearby Long Marston held Italian inmates, POWs of the Second World War. Many of these men were interviewed in the wake of the crime, and as the prisoners were allowed to roam freely in the local area, they were naturally put on the suspects list. In fact, on the day of the murder, many prisoners had travelled to Stratford to see a play, whilst others attended the cinema. However, after dozens of interviews were undertaken, it was determined that none of the prisoners were worthy of further investigation. An old friend of Walton's was also put under the spotlight, albeit for a short while. 72-year-old George Higgins and Charles Walton were known to have fallen out the previous Christmas, possibly over the lending of money, but it was decided by the investigation team that Higgins was too old and too frail to have carried out such a brutal attack. Other stories of financial agreements gone wrong circulated, and there was one claim that Walton was killed by two local men who had owed him money after an argument ensued and ended in the manslaughter of Walton. But the men's identities were never confirmed, and the trail went cold. Alfred Potter mentioned to the police when interviewed that he had seen Walton in the fields just after 12 p.m. on the day he died, although he said he did not have time to approach him because he had to tend to one of his cows that had been stranded in a ditch in another field. When police mentioned their intention to take fingerprints from the murder weapons, Potter told them that he had handled the murder weapons when he discovered the body along with Edith and her neighbour Harry Beasley. He claimed that Beasley had told him to move the tools in order to get a closer look at Walton's body. Beasley denied the claim and said it was a blatant attempt at explaining away his prints if they were found. Eventually, though, no prints were found. Potter then went on to blame the Italian POWs for the crime, calling them fascists. After hearing of the police's intervention within the prison camp, and that at least one of the prisoners there was a suspect, Potter could not contain his happiness, and it said that he had almost been hysterical with delight. This did not help his case. Nor did it help his case that he insistently complained of being cold and wanting to go back to his house when being questioned at the murder scene. The police thought this was unusual behaviour from a farmer who must have been used to tending to animals at all hours of the day outside, and put it down to possible guilt. His earlier claim that he was tending to a distressed cow at the given time of the murder also went under scrutiny when police discovered that the animal had already died hours earlier. This was also contradicted in a later statement from Potter when he said he had actually gone home after seeing Walton at work in the field, as opposed to tending to the animal. But probably most damning of all were the stains on Alfred Potter's trousers. Professor Webster, the forensic scientist on the case, believed that it could have been blood, but the trousers had been washed thoroughly since February 14th, making it impossible for a positive analysis. Yet again, money was another considered motive. Some journalists at the time speculated that Walton had owed Potter money, and that Potter had killed him out of frustration for not receiving it or being refused it. Walton's niece, Edith, disputed this claim, saying that her uncle had inherited £300 in 1937 from his late wife, but by 1945 that money had dwindled to almost nothing, leaving him nothing to lend. Could it be that he had simply lent his inheritance to people who took advantage of his good nature with no real intention of paying him back? Ultimately, it was decided that there was not enough evidence to charge Alfred Potter, although Robert Fabian admitted that he believed Potter to be a cunning individual. A series of folklore tales and half-truths are said to have been elaborated on during the undertaking of the case. Some say that these stories are 100% true, whilst others say they are pure fabrication. I personally don't know for sure what is fact and what is fiction here, so I'll explain a little more about the mythologies that are said to be linked to this case, so you can draw your own conclusions. There is a common belief, and one which is mentioned in the 1971 BBC documentary The Power of the Witch, that a woman by the name of Anne Tennant from nearby Long Compton was murdered in exactly the same way 70 years prior in September of 1875. But it's since been upheld that Anne Tennant was not pinned to the ground with a pitchfork, nor did she have her throat slit. She was attacked, according to the official report, on her way to a local shop. Local man and self-proclaimed witch hunter James Hayward set upon the 79-year-old woman and stabbed her with a pitchfork to the head and torso. A local farmer by the name of John Taylor intervened, soon to be joined by Mrs. Tennant's daughter Elizabeth Hughes. But by then Anne Tennant's wounds were too severe and she eventually died 3 days later. At the inquest, it was discovered that James Hayward had actually planned a killing spree and had intended on killing up to 16 different women in the area, all of whom he believed to be witches. Hayward was from the village of Lower Quinton and was believed to be a mentally disturbed alcoholic. Despite popular mythology, the only similarity between this 1875 case and the 1945 case is that a pitchfork was the murder weapon. There is a possibility that Anne Tennant was Charles Walton's great-grandmother, although this has never been proven. It's a claim based on tenuous links that makes many assumptions regarding surnames, birthplaces and bloodlines of generations past, so it's difficult to take it seriously. The theory later arose that Charles Walton was involved in witchcraft himself. His natural affinity with animals is one of the reasons for this. Walton was said to have communicated with animals in a way no one could fathom. His ability to befriend aggressive dogs and the fact that he spoke to the birds was enough to label him a potential member of the occult. There is also the rumour that he cast a so-called evil eye curse over the village in 1944 and released a plague of toads into the fields, making the land in the area barren and useless for the rearing of crops. 1944 was reportedly a bad year for crops in and around Lower Quinton. The harvest was said to have been late and unfruitful. It was strongly believed by some that Walton may have been murdered ritualistically so that his blood might soak back into the soil to replenish it and undo the spell he had cast. A grim act of retribution. This theory takes us to our next historical claim. It just so happened that St. Valentine's Day in 1945 fell on Ash Wednesday, a significant day in the Christian calendar, but a day, according to some, particularly rich in association with black magic. It's said to be the day that the Druids made human sacrifices to the earth. They supposedly killed their victims with knives and allowed their blood to drain away and enrich the soil. If this is true, then the theory is a strong one, and the historical link is hard to ignore. Edith Walton was interviewed by Michael Bakewell for the aforementioned 1971 BBC documentary The Power of the Witch. During the interview, she said that she didn't believe that witchcraft was involved at all, and that it was just media speculation to attract public interest. She had lived with Charles for the vast majority of her life, and saw no signs that he was at all involved in witchcraft. She stated without hesitation that none of it was true. When pressed by the interviewer about whether she had met anyone involved in witchcraft, given the local history, she said that she had never met anyone who had any links at all. In fact, she claimed to have never even heard of any of the witchcraft stories surrounding Warwickshire. Given that much of the stories at the time of the murder have now been demoted to the realms of mythology, maybe she was simply a skeptic who didn't want to entertain the notion of witchcraft in her hometown.